Hey, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, PSC 201, American Government. Whatever time of the day you're consuming this bit of educational media, welcome aboard. This will be our first online lecture. It's probably going to last right about an hour. We're going to be continuing with Chapter 4 on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. Let me just give you a quick rundown on where we're at as far as Aiken Technical College, as far as this class, this specifically is concerned. You all know by now that Governor McMaster, Governor of South Carolina, decided to close all schools, which included technical colleges as well as high schools. So there was no opportunity anymore for us to meet in a face-to-face class. The leadership at Aiken Technical College made the decision to transition all face-to-face classes, including early college classes, from a face-to-face classroom format over into an online format. It's taken me a couple of days to sort of get all that sorted out. This semester I'm teaching one online class already, interpersonal communications. I had 4 public speaking sections, and then I have this section of American Government. So we're now back up and running. You've had a week off. Hopefully everything is going well. Hopefully you are all staying safe. Hopefully you all remember that Governor McMaster can do that because of the key principle we've been talking about, federalism, which is incredibly important. So what we're going to do from now for the rest of this, as long as this lasts, again, we are definitely not going to be back together before the 1st of April. And then I would imagine probably on the 31st of March, there may be a decision made by the governor to extend this through the end of the semester, possibly even to the end of May. So we are prepared to deal with that. The way we're going to move forward with that is you will be seeing lectures from here, the beautiful Casa McInnes in lovely Grovetown, Georgia. You'll be seeing me in a t-shirt, because one of the great things about doing online classes now is I can give lectures in a t-shirt and sweatpants. But you'll be seeing me sitting here in front of my incredibly cluttered bookshelf. And I will be giving you lectures. I will be posting the, let me kill that email so that noise doesn't keep coming up. Okay, I will be posting the slides in the PDF format in the documents, in the Blackboard documents. We're going to start with that today. I've got the slides already uploaded. You're going to have all the time you need to watch the lecture. There's not going to be a whole lot of structure to it. There are going to be 2 timed events, though. One is going to be every lecture will have associated with it a discussion question. And I will just show you how that's going to work. But your discussion questions are going to be worth 25 points. And they are going to replace the pop quizzes that we didn't get to. And I'm not anticipating that we will get to. Also, I'm still going to continue to assign the current events reports. And we'll discuss how that's going to happen. But your answer to those discussion questions and your current events reports will be posted to the discussion boards on Blackboard. Okay? And I'll talk about that. I'll be sending out, today is the 18th of March. I'll be sending out the first notification through the announcements for the first group to do their current events reports online. It's real simple. You'll copy and paste the link to your article in the discussion board, and then you'll give us a 1-paragraph summary of the article. Again, a full paragraph. And I'm going to stress what I mean by, and for the discussion boards, it's going to say full paragraph. I'm going to tell you what I mean by that. I don't mean 3 sentences. A full paragraph should be 6 or 7 sentences. 2 paragraphs would be great as well if you're not confident of that. Okay? So let's go ahead and get started with today's lecture. I'll get back to the discussion questions at the end of the lecture when we're done. What I want you to do right now is go ahead and go to the documents section on Blackboard for the class. You will find a PDF document there called Chapter 4. I want you to go ahead and open up that chapter. That document, and when it's open, come back. If you need to pause the video here, go ahead and pause. It's because it may take a minute or 2 for you to open that document. So go ahead and do that. I'll be here when you get back. Okay, let's all assume you're back. All right, so you got that PDF open. If the PDF is not open, I want you to go ahead and open it, pause again, and come back to us when you're ready. Okay. So here's what I'm going to recommend you do. Unless you've got a really bigger screen than I've got camera with, okay, I'm going to recommend you put that PDF file up in front of this video display. You don't need to see my head and this bookshelf for the next 45 minutes. I am about to do that myself. Then we'll move on. So the slide you want to go to in the PDF is where we left off, called Rights in Conflict. It says who gets to decide which or whose rights are more important. And then you've got a picture of the President, the Attorney General, the Chief Justice, the Governor, the Aiken County Sheriff, and the South Carolina Attorney General. Okay? So let's go on to the next slide. So, and I will cue you when we're changing slides. Okay? So don't worry about that. So where we're at now is the Constitution gives us very few civil rights. The enumerated rights, as they're called, are four. They're very simple. There's no religious test for office. In other words, they can't ask you if you're a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, or anything else as a requirement to achieve office. Habeas corpus, the right of habeas corpus. We've already discussed that many, many times in class, so everybody should understand what habeas corpus is. It is an enumerated rights. It's explicitly listed in the Constitution. There's no ex post facto laws. In other words, we can't tell you, make a law saying that you did something in the past that was illegal, so we're going to punish you for it now. If it wasn't against the law when you did it, it's not you can't be punished for it further on down the line. And there's no bill of attainder, which is an act of Congress that singles out an individual or a small group for punishment without a trial. Now, you have to remember when the founding fathers wrote the Constitution, they were doing something very specific. They didn't want to get into the hassle over all the rights. They wanted to establish the mechanics of a government, a federalist government. And so what they did was they simply in the articles of the Constitution, they only wanted to give the framework for a functional government. They considered these four enumerated rights to be all the rights that an individual needed in order to make the government function. Okay? So as it says in that bottom bullet, we are reliant on the Bill of Rights, which were those 10 original amendments to the Constitution and the subsequent amendments to that, and the courts for all our other rights. Now, again, what most people say when they say, well, the Constitution guarantees me the freedom to do it, the Constitution doesn't. It's the Bill of Rights and the subsequent amendments and the courts that have given people those freedoms. Okay, we're moving to the next slide, which is the United States v. Brown. So let's talk about Bill of Attainder a little bit. It's not something we've talked about in class so far. So Archie Brown, his picture is here, was born in 1911. His parents had both recently immigrated from the Jewish persecution in Russia. He grew up in the United States, was born and raised in the United States. He was a committed communist. He jumped a freighter in the mid-1930s. He stowed away on a freighter to get to Europe, and he enlisted in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade in the Spanish Civil War. The Abraham Lincoln Brigade was a group of Americans who volunteered to fight in the Spanish Civil War, which, although it was called Nationalists and Republicans, it was basically communist versus fascist. And a lot of really young, idealistic Americans went to Spain, enlisted in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and then fought in the Spanish Civil War. He comes back to the United States. He knocks around for a couple of years. Then at the beginning of World War II, he enlists in the United States Army. He didn't get drafted. He enlisted. He volunteered. And he fought in the 76th Infantry Division at the Battle of the Bulge. He saw heavy combat. He was a combat veteran. That did not preclude him from continuing to be a communist. He became a high-ranking member of the Communist Party in the United States. He had moved to San Francisco, which was a real hub of communist activity. At one point in time in the 1950s, during the Red Scare, during the McCarthy witch hunts, when people were being arrested simply for being a communist and having charges figured out later. He did go into hiding because he was such a high-profile communist. He was elected to the board of the local International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union in 1959. The Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act, LMRDA, of 1959, forbade any Communist Party member from serving as an executive officer of any labor union. Brown was elected to the board of his union 3 times, and then in 1961 he was arrested for violation of the MLRDA. Archie Brown, go to the next slide, please. Archie Brown is convicted of violating the MLRDA. He appeals to the Ninth Circuit Court in San Francisco, which overturns his conviction, saying the LMRDA violates both the Fourth and the Fifth Amendments to the Constitution. Again, that's illegal search and seizure and self-incrimination. The United States government appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the first thing that Chief Justice Warren said was that the law was clearly a bill of attainder in which legislative punishment of any form or severity of specifically designated persons or group, in no uncertain terms, person who poses the feared characteristics. In other words, he said, this was a law simply to punish a small group of people. It was not done for the general welfare. It was done to punish individuals. Just by saying you can't become an officer in your union because you're a communist is, by its very nature, a bill of attainder. Okay? Interestingly enough, in writing the opinion for the court, Chief Justice Warren ignored Archie Brown's Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights. Didn't even think it was needed to be argued. He said, he just completely ignored those and said that this is such an obvious example of a bill of attainder that we don't even need to have the conversation about the bigger Fourth and Fifth Amendment issue. Excuse me. So again, a bill of attainder is a law passed to punish an individual or a small group without the benefit of a trial. And Chief Justice Warren felt that not allowing someone to be elected as a senior leader in their union was punishment without a trial. So that's an example of a bill of attainder. So let's talk about our right to speak freely. You guys know as students, your rights to speak freely are impinged upon every day. The Supreme Court has held over and over again that the clothes we wear are literally an expression of free speech. It's freedom of expression. The First Amendment in the Bill of Rights says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So a lot of times we focus on, when we talk about the First Amendment, we focus on religion. We focus on freedom of speech and freedom of press. But it's that last one that really sort of goes to the heart of everything about the freedom of expression in the First Amendment to the Constitution. Because if we don't have the right to look at our elected officials and say, hey, we don't think you're doing a good job, we don't like what you're doing, what good is the freedom of expression? And so, since the signing of the Constitution, since the adopting of the Bill of Rights, there has been this tension, as we've talked about, between what people should be allowed to do and what's good for the entire nation. And surprisingly enough, this started at the very beginning, involving people who actually wrote those amendments and helped write the Constitution. And we're talking here specifically, the balding gentleman on the left is John Adams, the second president of the United States. The historically known as the good-looking guy on the right in this equation is Thomas Jefferson. And we've already talked about Adams and Jefferson and their struggles before. Remember, Adams was seen as, he was short, he was dumpy, he was seen as dour, which is a way to say just not in a very good mood. Jefferson was tall. He was good looking, and this is a later portrait. Earlier, he had really bright red hair. He was very he was a great conversationalist, very well liked. So these people are like polar opposites personality, and they became polar opposites politically. And even though they had been great friends in the 70s and 70s, 80s, they became really, by 1796, they became desperate enemies. In 1798, Jefferson had been the ambassador of France. He comes back during the middle in 1798, which we're going to be talking about. 1798 begins a period which was called the Quasi-Guerre, which is French for quasi-war. It's a sort of war. It's also called the pseudo-war sometimes. But from 1798 to 1800, we were de facto, without a declaration, at war with France on the high seas on the Atlantic Ocean. Remember that the French Revolution overthrows King Louis. He is executed, and because King Louis had been very ardent supporter of the United States, not necessarily because he loved democracy, but because he hated the English. He was a great friend of the United States, so when he was executed, the United States just said, our debt was to the King of France, the debt resulting from the Revolutionary War. They said, our debt was to the King of France, and if the King of France is dead, and he does not have an heir to assume his estate, we no longer owe anybody any money. Well, the revolutionary French government said, fine. If you don't want to give us the money you owe us, we're just going to start taking your ships. Okay? So that's the rough national, international equivalent of looking at your cousin and saying, hey, listen, I loaned you $50. You're not going to pay me back. Fine, I'm taking your TV set. Okay? It's about the same thing. So this tension that was, and again, out on the Atlantic, if you were on a U.S. or French ship in the Atlantic Ocean, and people come sailing over the horizon and start firing cannons at you, it doesn't appear in any way to be a quasi-war. It is a real war, and people are getting killed. So the Federalists saw immigrants as a major threat to national security at this point. This is an elected member of Congress said, there is no need to, quote, invite hordes of wild Irishmen, nor the turbulent and disorderly of all the world to come here with a basic view to distract our tranquility. The Alien Acts were passed to target immigrants. And a lot of those immigrants were not supporters of Adams' Federalist Party. They were supporters of Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. So while we can construe that and say that Adams was really working to preserve the tranquility, preserve the peace within the United States, many people perceived it, and to say this, many historians now perceive it, that really what Adams was doing was trying to quell and to keep immigrants from coming into the United States so he would not have to deal with them in the election that's coming up in 1800. Okay? So the first of the Alien and Sedition Acts were the Alien Act that was passed in 1796. The Sedition Act was passed following to that. Representative John Allen of Connecticut said, liberty of the press and of opinion is calculated to destroy all confidence between man and man. It leads to the dissolution of every bond of union. So you've got members of the U.S. House of Representatives arguing that freedom of speech, that thing that they had just encoded into the Bill of Rights a mere 5 years earlier, was now going to, or 9 years earlier, was going to lead to the destruction of the Union itself. So that First Amendment had to be curtailed. So Congress passed and President Adams signed the Sedition Act, which made it illegal to, quote, write, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government of the United States. Okay? Think about that. If you write, print, and again, if you in any way communicate any false and malicious writing, and who determines whether or not it's false? The government does. Not the people, not the courts. The government determines whether or not it's against if it's against the government. So it becomes in John Adams' best interest. He has a law that says anytime anybody criticizes me, I am the government of the United States. You are uttering, printing, or writing things scandalous and malicious against the government, and he would go out and arrest them. About 50 newspaper editors were arrested pretty much immediately because they were in opposition to the Federalist government. Matthew Leon of Vermont said this showed Adams had an unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and self-avarice. Now, the key thing to know about Representative Leon's comments was he only spoke about President Adams as a person. He did not speak about the government. He did not speak about the office of the presidency. He spoke only about Adams, and Adams had him arrested and imprisoned. But again, many times in American history, when somebody tries to push too hard, it backfires on them. Leon was imprisoned, he was tried, he was convicted, he was put in jail for 4 months, he was fined $1,000, and while he was awaiting trial, the people of the state of Vermont elected him in a landslide back to his position in the U.S. House of Representatives representing Vermont. The whole thing really just backfired. Adams was already unpopular before the election of 1800. He was unpopular before the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1796. And these things just made him, they went from being, showing him as being unpopular, pompous, dour, to being tyrannical was the way it was produced. The election boiled down to, Adams wasn't even in contention. It boiled down between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Neither one of them got a plurality or a majority or 50% plus one of the votes. So it went into the U.S. House of Representatives where each state was given a vote. There were 16 states at the time, and you have to have a majority. Vermont and Maryland delegations within the House split, so they did not vote. They entered blank ballots because you had to have a simple majority within each state. Those two states split evenly, so there were 14 states voting. It took 35 ballots to elect Thomas Jefferson president and Aaron Burr, who came in second, which was the way back then. He came in. He was the vice president. Thomas Jefferson, remember, has started a new political party. He's a Democratic Republican. Up to this point, every office in the executive branch had been filled by a Federalist. Jefferson wants to do away with the Alien and Sedition Acts, but knows he doesn't have the votes in Congress just to outright get rid of them because there's still a lot of anti-immigrant feeling within the Congress. He can't rely on the courts for a couple of reasons. First of all the judges that have been appointed by either George Washington or John Adams, who were both ardent Federalists. The courts are packed with Federalists. They hate Thomas Jefferson, and they know that, and they're probably going to push back against the president. Okay? Remember, with Marbury versus Madison, John Marshall did not put out the writ of mandamus because he knew that he was in opposition to Jefferson, and Jefferson would just ignore him. Well, that sentiment went both ways between the president and the courts at that time. So Jefferson knew that if he went to the courts, they might well ignore him or just not support him. And also remember, this is before Marbury v. Madison. And one of the key things that comes out of Marbury v. Madison, even though it wasn't technically on the docket, John Marshall brings in judicial review of law. That's still several years down the road. So what Jefferson does is novel and unique, and he reaches out to his allies in the states, in multiple states, to where they came out and they said, hey, listen, under federalism, they said, we do not approve the Alien and Sedition Acts. We are no longer going to allow them to be enforced within our state boundaries. Now, this is very novel. This is very unique. And while it was expedient for Jefferson's aims, that concept of nullification, where the state can nullify a federal law and choose to ignore its a prosecution within their state boundaries lays the framework for a precedence for strong state rights. It undermines the supremacy clause of the Constitution that grants the federal government supremacy over the states. And ultimately, when people start to draw a line back to what led us to the outbreak of the Civil War, this is where, for many people, this timeline begins. Because Jefferson aggressively tells the states to ignore federal law and to publicly ignore federal law. And ultimately, what that boils down to is a break within the Constitution. And ultimately, states decide to go to war or to rebel against the federal government in order to maintain that right that is clearly not supported by the Constitution. Okay? So let's move on to the next slide. We're going to jump forward, okay, to World War I. So I want you to look at the poster. This is a propaganda poster, a savings bond poster that was put out by the U.S. government in World War I. You can see the tenor. The Hun was what was a slur for Germans, based on the Huns were a tribe in Germany that when the Roman Empire began to collapse, the Huns overran large parts. They were not nice people. And so this is a sort of a racial slur talking about the Germans. You see how they typified the Germans. So as we enter World War I in June of 1917, Congress passes the Espionage Acts. And there was a whole host of authorities given in the Espionage Act. And to be honest with you, you remember last week I talked to you about how I was still obligated under the Espionage Acts to protect information. And some of those are passed in June of 1917. Some of those requirements are that old. They're 103 years old. So the Espionage Acts weren't all necessarily bad. We didn't really have laws to require people to protect sensitive government information before that, so we needed that. But as is often the case during time of crisis, we see that the prosecution of those laws goes to the extreme. And also, when you're passing a law that everybody likes, people like to stick things in there that probably shouldn't have been. But rather than kill the whole act, they'll suffer that little part down at the bottom that they don't like. One of the things that got written into the Espionage Act was it gave the post office the authority to ban newspapers and magazines that advocating obstructing the draft. Now, World War I, we had the draft for a little while back during the Civil War. And now, let me tell you, a lot of people talk fondly about the draft and say we should go back to the draft where you were forced where young men, usually between the ages of 18 and 25, were forced to go into the Army for usually a period of time anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. When they instigated the draft during the Civil War, there were riots. Thousands of people were killed in New York City during the draft riots, which quickly turned into becoming race riots, because these New Yorkers felt like they were being forced into war in order to protect African Americans. And so what started out as a race riot quickly turned to a race riot where African Americans in New York City were lynched. The draft, contrary to what anybody tells you, during World War I and World War II, yeah, people went along with it, but the draft has never really been popular. In 1940, when they started the draft, again before World War II, there was a big things that were being paid in OHIO, which it was spells Ohio, but also said Over the Hill in October, where when National Guardsmen, if they were going to be called into, they felt they were going to be called to active duty in October, they were talking about mass desertions. So the draft has never really been popular in the United States. So the Congress, sort of getting ahead of that game, tells the post office, you have the authority to ban newspapers and magazines that advocate obstruction of the draft. Violations of the Espionage Acts of 1917 could include a $10,000 fine and 20 years in jail. Then, following up on that, in May 1918, Congress passes the Sedition Act, where it becomes illegal to, quote, willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of the United States government. So again, if you go back a couple of slides and look at the language from the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, you're going to see almost the exact same thing, word for word. So basically, it became illegal by May of 1918. It became illegal to criticize the government of the United States and to recommend and to advocate obstructing of the draft. 2,100 people were arrested under these acts. This was not a joke and a historic footnote. In 1917 and 1918, the Espionage and Sedition Acts were serious business for people. And if you got caught out talking against the war, wondering why we were getting engaged in this European conflict, you could go to jail. And that wasn't a joke for people. Go to the next slide. So it all sort of came to a head in Schenck versus the United States. This is a picture of Charles Schenck here on the right. Again, we're entering a period of time with fabulous mustaches. You're going to see another one in just a minute. Charles Schenck was a prominent member of the Socialist Party of the United States. The Socialist Party of the United States was vehemently opposed to the United States entering World War I. They saw the First World War, which was then being called the Great War, as nothing more than capitalists arguing over markets, arguing over the means of production, and using the common man as just cannon fodder to be fed into the maw of the war to be destroyed. The socialists felt, and you know, there could be an argument for this, that nobody was going to benefit from this war except for industrialists. Rich people were going to get richer, poor people were going to get killed, and that was going to be the sum total of this war. So Schenck attempted to mail 15,000 flyers encouraging young men to dodge the draft, to avoid the draft, to avoid their call-up notices, to not report if they got them. He was arrested under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. He was convicted. He was sentenced to 6 months in jail, and he appeals to the United States Supreme Court. Go to the next slide. Again, you'll see a picture of someone with a fabulous mustache. That is Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. He served on the Supreme Court for 30 years. Spent a short period of time as the acting Chief Justice when the Chief Justice died suddenly. But Schenck argues that his flyers are protected under the First Amendment and that the espionage and sedition laws are unconstitutional. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court of the United States did not agree with him. The court held that the Espionage Act did not violate the First Amendment and was an appropriate exercise of Congress's wartime authority. And they applied a test called the clear and present danger test. As Justice Holmes said, the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. The question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. It is a question of proximity and degree. Okay, this was also, and you'll still hear the phrase all the time, shouting fire in a crowded theater. This was, you know, the question for Justice Holmes, and the court agreed with him, and Justice Holmes is writing the opinion for the majority, was that does the Speech Act constitute a clear and present danger to the general public? In this case, did Schenck's flyers create a clear and present danger that young men would not report for the draft, thus causing the United States and its allies to lose the First World War? This test, the clear and present danger test, would be the standard. This ruling was handed down in 1919, actually long after the war was already over. And it would stand, the clear and present danger test, or as it's often called, shouting fire in a crowded theater test, would be used for decades. And we're going to talk about the time when it was actually rolled off of and no longer held as precedence. But again, This is the court saying your First Amendment rights are not universal. They're not absolute. You don't get to use them universally whenever you want to. So this case, Schenck versus the United States, stands as precedence until 1969. Two lovely individuals here. And it came up in Brandenburg versus Ohio. Charles Brandenburg is the Ku Klux Klanman standing on the left. He's 48 years old, senior official within the Ohio clavern of the Ku Klux Klan. The individual on the right in the fetching tan is Richard Hanna. He's a Nazi. He was peripherally associated with this case. He was arrested under the same statutes. Everything, the two cases were kind of lumped together. This is a photo that AP got them to pose, which I gotta figure they both were. That's just a bad photo. It's probably an accurate photo because the guy on the left was a Klansman and the guy on the right's a Nazi. They're clearly both horrible people. But that being said, they do have a right to have their cases heard in court. So in 1964, Charles Brandenburg, the guy on the right, on the left of the Klan robes, decides to hold a Klan rally. He's going to marshal the forces of the invisible empire of the Ku Klux Klan. Apparently about 45 or 50 people showed up, but he invited the media to the rally. And he got what he wanted. A local TV station came in and aired his speech at this rally, which was full of anti-Semitic and racist statements. And again, what you're going to find out listening to these guys is that they're not well educated. They're not, in many cases, not very smart. He talked about revengeance against the Jews and blacks in the event that the federal government continued to suppress the white Caucasian race. The white Caucasian race, and specifically the Ku Klux Klan, would take acts of revengeance on the people they felt were pushing this. Ohio had and again, here's another wonderful word. He was arrested under Ohio's criminal syndicalism law. And a syndicalism is somebody who was trying to build a criminal syndicate, which made it illegal to advocate the duty, necessity, or propriety of crime, sabotage, violence, or unlawful methods of terrorism, as opposed to the lawful methods of terrorism. That phrase has always struck me as weird. The unlawful methods of terrorism is a means of accomplishing industrial or political form. So what this law states, the criminal syndicalism law of the state of Ohio, says it is illegal to tell someone that it is their duty, or it is necessary, or it is correct for them to be involved in any criminal acts, sabotage, violence, or any terrorism acts. If you say sabotage, violence, terrorism, crime is your duty, it's necessary, and it's the right thing to do, you're in violation of this law. So Brandenburg was arrested, he was charged, he was convicted, he appealed to the Ohio Supreme Court. The interesting part about what happened at the Ohio Supreme Court is that they didn't even listen to his constitutional argument that he had a right to say those things. And so, since they didn't listen to it, the American Civil Liberties Union, which is a liberal defense law nonprofit, who usually defends, at that time, were heavily engaged in workplace equality for women, civil rights cases, takes the very important constitutional and very unpopular decision to take the case. The American Civil Liberties Union, which is usually seen as a very liberal organization, decides that the issues in Brandenburg v. Ohio are of such significant constitutional nature that they take the very unpopular decision to take the case. And in 1969, this case goes to the Supreme Court. 10 years later, or about 15 years later, the ACLU would also decide to defend a group of Nazis, neo-Nazis in Illinois, in Skokie, Illinois, and when they were denied the right to march. Again, these are very unpopular. I mean, these are decisions of principles which the ACLU made that were very unpopular. The court unanimously decides to overthrow the Ohio criminal syndicalism law. Justice William O. Douglas, who you see here, the days of fabulous mustaches on the Supreme Court is over. Justice William O. Douglas, who is a great liberal writer of decisions through the civil rights movement, applied what has been called as the two-prong test to whether or not restriction of speech is appropriate. First, speech can be prevented if it is directed at inciting or producing imminent lawless action. Okay? And the speeches, and also the speech must be likely to incite or produce such action. So, in order to be restricted speech, in order for the First Amendment to be restricted, a speech act or an expression has to be for the purpose of getting people to do lawless actions, okay, to riot, to commit crimes, to commit terrorist acts. Or it has to be and it has to be likely to incite or produce such actions. So if I stand on a street corner and I start screaming at people at the top of my lungs that we should go out and burn every public library in the United States, nobody is going to listen to me. Yes, my speech does meet the first question of the, quote, two-prong test. I am directing people at inciting or producing a lawless action. But me standing on a street corner by myself, screaming at people, is not likely to incite or produce such action. So then I do not meet Justice Douglas's two-prong test. Any attempt to arrest me or charge me with that is going to be overturned by the court. Or for at least as long as Brandenburg v. Ohio stands, and it still does stand as precedent. This explicitly overturned Schenck v. the U.S. as precedents. They are now no longer saying that clear and present danger test that was applied during the First World War, is applicable. The court says explicitly that that is no longer the case. Schenck v. U.S. is now overturned. So in this case, stare decisis did not prevent them from overturning that decision. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to wrap up. Where are we at here? Let me check my time. We're at, okay, about 45 minutes. That's good for a first one. Okay, so here's the discussion question I'm going to ask you to answer for 25 points. This is what you're going to be doing instead of having pop quizzes from now on. Okay, the discussion question. We have discussed the importance and the court's desire to follow the principle of stare decisis. But many of the most important cases we have looked at have overturned prior decisions. Thus, they have ignored stare decisis. What factors do you see that could cause the court to overturn a prior decision? Okay? It's a real simple question. Now, I'm going to go ahead and give you a hint about what the right answer is. There is no right answer. What I want to see when I ask you these discussion questions is for you to have an idea, for you to support the idea with some solid arguments in 6-8 sentences maybe. Trust me, for college courses, that's incredibly short. Okay? Your answers must be posted to the discussion board on Blackboard before noon on Monday, March the 23rd. This exercise is worth 23 points. Now, I want you to scroll to the next slide, and I'll show you how to do that, okay? If you look in the blue part on this slide, over here on the left-hand side under PSC 201-077, 2020 SB1, if you go down that column, okay, the next to the last white font on the blue background toward the bottom is discussion board. You'll see that line, then you'll say course documents, which you already know how to find because you're looking at these slides. You'll see assignments, which I don't ever use. You'll see discussion boards. Discussion board is where you want to go. You're going to want to click on the discussion board. And that's going to bring up a field on the right that's going to take up about 3/4 of the frame. This is going to list all the discussions that are currently ongoing. All right. So here you have what I set up as an example form. I did this before I put the discussion question on there. So you will click right where it says example form. You'll have your little pointy finger pop up, and you will pick that. Okay? Now, if you go to the next slide, what you're then going to see is you're going to see everyone who has contributed. So you'll see me first. Victor McInnes will be listed as the author. I'll be up at the top on every one of these because I'm the only person that's allowed to create a forum. Create a forum. You're going to see, you'll see forum, and then it'll say example forum, and then there'll be some smaller writing. Right underneath that, you're going to see create thread. You will click create thread, okay? Remember, you click on discussion board. You will go down to the discussion question. You'll click on the discussion question. You'll see my initial entry. You'll see everyone who has already contributed to that discussion board. So you are then going to click create thread. You'll be asked to give your thread a topic, okay? And then you'll go ahead and type in, and I would recommend you do it because the controls and the commands from Blackboard are completely different. You can't just, right-click paste on this. Paste it. If you're on an Apple machine, it's Command-V. If you're on a Windows machine, it's Control. It's just very complicated. So I'm going to recommend that you go ahead and write out, maybe on a notepad, and then type in. After you click create thread, then you're going to go ahead and do that. Okay, all right. So that brings us up to speed as to where we want to be today. This is Wednesday, the 18th of March. So on Monday, the 23rd of March, I want you to come back here, join me again in Casa McInnes in lovely Grovetown, Georgia, where I will be sitting in front of my very cluttered bookshelves, and I will continue our lections. We're going to wind up Civil Rights and Civil Liberties on Monday. Then we will post another lecture on Wednesday where we're going to jump into political parties and start talking about that. At least I hope to wind up. Every time I lecture on civil liberties and civil rights, it just grows and grows and grows. So I want to keep these to about an hour, so I knew we weren't going to make it today. So Monday, March 23rd, expect to see another lecture post on here. An announcement will be sent out from Blackboard. It'll be great. You'll be fine. And then there'll be another discussion question posted on Monday, and that'll be another 25 points. And again, today I'm going to be sending out the current events report group that needs to go ahead and post their current events report by Monday. Okay? All right. Everybody, stay safe. Be careful. This disease, for you young people under 18, you don't seem to get it, but you spread it to old folks like us. So please take the social distancing seriously. I think Governor McMaster was in physical pain when he closed schools from the looks on some of the press conferences. But I think he even understands that we needed to take this very seriously. So please take it very seriously. We will see you hopefully soon. We know this is in place until the 31st. Hopefully I'll see you guys on the 1st of April. And everything will be better by then. But if not, we're ready to go forward with your education and making you fully educated citizens of the state of South Carolina and Aiken County. All right. Take care and stay safe.